Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I hadn't planned on staying in the woods for more than a week. The solitude was supposed to be a break, a reset from the chaotic life I had led in Los Angeles. The city had chewed me up, and by the time I realized it, I was barely hanging on. I was a photographer once in demand, capturing the urban jungle with an eye for its raw edges. But as the years passed, my work had become stale. The calls stopped coming, and before long I was just another guy with a camera. So when my friend Mark told me about the old cabin in the Ouachita Mountains, I jumped at the chance to disappear for a while. The cabin was isolated, no running water, no electricity, exactly what I needed. It was tucked away in a dense forest where the nearest town was 30 miles out, and cell service was non-existent. It was perfect. I arrived on a Tuesday, if I recall correctly. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown path leading to the cabin. As I pulled up in my rental car, the first thing that struck me was the silence. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. The cabin itself was everything Mark said it would be, old but sturdy, with a wood stove for heat and a small creek running behind it for water. It was clear that no one had been here in years. The place had a thick layer of dust, and the air smelled like damp wood and old leaves. I spent the first day cleaning up, chopping wood, and settling in. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the shadows stretch longer and longer until they merged with the encroaching night, I felt the first twinge of something odd. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. I'm no stranger to the outdoors. I've spent my fair share of time in forests, deserts, and mountains, and there's always some noise. Crickets, birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, but here there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination. After all, that's why I was here, to clear my mind. I didn't think much of it as I headed inside, lit a fire in the stove, and settled down for the night. The bed was lumpy and the sheets were stiff from disuse, but I was exhausted and sleep came quickly. It was the next day when things started getting strange. I woke up late, groggy, with a dull headache. The air inside the cabin was heavy, almost suffocating despite the coolness of the morning. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, maybe snap some pictures if I found anything interesting. I grabbed my camera and headed out, following a deer trail that wound through the thick underbrush. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. As I walked, the silence persisted, an oppressive blanket that seemed to smother everything around me. After about an hour, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach turn. A clearing with a large flat stone in the center, stained dark brown with what looked like old blood. The smell hit me before I even realized what I was looking at. Iron and decay, thick and cloying. My first instinct was to leave, but I forced myself to stay, to examine the scene more closely. The stone was slick with dried blood, and there were remnants of something scattered around it. Bones, small and brittle, and what looked like tufts of fur. My hand shook as I lifted the camera to my eye, snapping a few shots before I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, a predator that had used the stone as a place to feed. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't a hunter, but I'd seen enough animal remains to know this was different. The bones were clean, too clean, as if they had been picked over with care. And the blood, it wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old enough to have been from months ago. Something had been here recently. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, the door locked, the windows shuttered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there waiting for me. The silence, which had been unsettling before, now felt ominous. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside set my nerves on edge. That night, sleep didn't come as easily. I tossed and turned, the images of the clearing replaying in my mind. And then I heard it, the sound that would change everything. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire, but it grew louder, closer. It was a scratching, a scraping against the wooden walls of the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound moved, circling the cabin slowly, methodically. My heart hammered in my chest as I listened, every muscle in my body tense, ready to spring. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Silence fell once more, thicker than before, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair by the stove, clutching the knife I'd brought with me, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The night passed, the sun eventually rising, though it brought no comfort. The next day I decided I had to leave. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. I packed my things quickly, barely eating or drinking, just wanting to be gone before night fell again. But as I stepped outside, something stopped me in my tracks. Footprints, large and deep, leading away from the cabin into the woods. They weren't human, too wide, too long, with claw marks at the tips. They looked like the prints of a bear, but there was something off about them, something that sent a chill down my spine. I followed them against my better judgment, my camera ready. The tracks led me back to the clearing with the stone, but it wasn't empty this time. There, in the center, was a carcass, a deer, its body torn open, its insides scattered across the ground. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of blood and rot that made my stomach lurch. I took a few steps closer, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the stone, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, was something that shouldn't exist. It was huge, standing on 4 legs, its body covered in matted fur. Its head was massive, its mouth filled with teeth that reminded me of a crocodile's, long and jagged. It was watching me, its chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, unable to move. It wasn't until it took a step forward, letting out a low, rumbling sound, that I snapped out of it. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the trees blurring as I tore through the forest. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. The next thing I knew, I was inside, the door bolted shut behind me, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the knife. The thing was out there, circling the cabin again, its heavy footsteps thudding against the earth. It was close, so close I could hear its breathing, deep and raspy, through the thin walls. And then it stopped, just like before. The silence was deafening, my own breath the only sound in the cabin. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, afraid that it would hear me, that it would come crashing through the door. Morning came, and with it a brief sense of relief. I had survived the night, but I knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave, had to get out of these woods before it came back. I grabbed my things, not bothering to pack properly, just shoving everything into my bag. I was about to step outside when I heard it again, the scratching right at the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The door rattled as if something was pushing against it, testing its strength. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The scratching stopped, replaced by a heavy thud, then another, like something was trying to break through. I didn't think. I just ran, bolting out the back door, my bag forgotten in the cabin. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The forest blurred around me, the trees seeming to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I didn't stop running until I burst out onto the dirt road, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. I kept going, pushing myself until I saw a car in the distance, a park ranger's vehicle. I waved him down, my voice hoarse as I tried to explain what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, but when we went back to the cabin, he saw the tracks, the blood, the destruction. We left together and I never looked back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. The ranger took me to town and I caught the first bus back to civilization. As for the creature, I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing. I'll never step foot in those woods again. But the story doesn't end there. The horrors I experienced in those woods haunted me long after I returned to the city. The nightmares began almost immediately. Vivid, terrifying dreams where I found myself back in that clearing, the creature looming over me, its hot breath on my face as it prepared to strike. I tried to go back to my old life, to pick up my camera and capture the city, as I once had. But everything had changed. The urban landscape that had once inspired me now seemed dull and lifeless compared to the primal fear I had experienced in the woods. I found myself drawn to the darker corners of the city, seeking out abandoned buildings and forgotten alleyways, as if trying to recapture that sense of isolation and dread. My work took on a new edge, a darkness that both excited and disturbed those who saw it. Galleries that had once ignored me now clamored for my photos, praising the raw emotion and unsettling atmosphere I managed to capture. But with each shot, I felt myself slipping further away from reality, lost in the memories of what I had seen. I became obsessed with researching the Ouachita Mountains and the surrounding area. I spent countless hours online, scouring news articles and local legends for any hint of similar encounters. And slowly a pattern began to emerge. Every few years, hikers would go missing in those woods. Search parties would be organized, but they rarely found anything more than abandoned campsites and strange tracks that couldn't be identified. One night, about 6 months after my experience, I received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line simply read, "The Beast of Ouachita." With trembling hands, I opened it to find a single image, a blurry photograph taken at night, showing a hulking shape moving between the trees. It was unmistakably the same creature I had seen. The email contained no other information, just a short message. "You're not alone. We need to talk." I spent the next week debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to delete the email, to try and forget everything that had happened. But a larger part, the part that had been changed by my experience, knew that I couldn't let this go. I had to know more. I replied to the email with a single word: "Where?" The response came quickly, giving me an address for a small diner on the outskirts of town. I was to come alone, late at night when the place would be nearly empty. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The diner was exactly as I had imagined. A run-down place with flickering neon signs and cracked vinyl booths. As I pushed open the door, the bell above it jangling softly, I saw only one other patron, an older man sitting in the far corner, his face hidden beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap. I slid into the booth across from him, my heart racing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, he raised his head, and I found myself looking into eyes that held the same haunted look I saw every day in the mirror. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He sighed, pushing a manila envelope across the table to me. "Then you need to see this. But I warn you, once you go down this rabbit hole, there's no coming back." With shaking hands, I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of photographs, news clippings, and handwritten notes. As I spread them out on the table, a chill ran down my spine. The photos showed glimpses of the creature I had seen, taken over decades. The news clippings detailed missing persons cases and unexplained animal attacks stretching back over a century. "What is this?" I finally managed to ask. The old man leaned forward, his eyes intense. "A history of terror. That thing you saw? It's been in those woods for longer than anyone knows. Some say it's a spirit of the forest. Others think it's some kind of prehistoric creature that survived in isolation. Me? I think it's something else entirely, something not of this world." He went on to tell me about a group of people who had dedicated their lives to tracking and studying the creature. They were a mix of survivors like us, researchers, and local folks who had grown up with the legends. They had been trying to piece together the mystery for years, but every time they got close, something would happen. Key members would disappear, research would be destroyed, as if something was actively working against them. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked, overwhelmed by the information. He smiled sadly. "Because you're one of us now. You've seen it, and it's seen you. And trust me, it doesn't forget. We need fresh eyes, someone with your skills to help document and maybe, finally, prove to the world that this thing exists." I sat back, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to run, to go back to my apartment and pretend none of this was happening. But I knew that wasn't an option. The creature, whatever it was, had changed me. I couldn't go back to my old life, not really. "What do you need me to do?" I heard myself asking. The old man's eyes lit up. "We're planning an expedition, back into the woods. We've got better equipment this time, more people. We're going to find this thing, document it, and make sure the world knows the truth." As he laid out the plans, I felt a mix of terror and excitement building inside me. I knew that going back into those woods was probably suicidal. The creature had nearly killed me once, and I had no doubt it would try again. But I also knew that I had to do this, not just for myself, but for all the others who had encountered this thing and never made it out to tell their story. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The next few months were a whirlwind of preparation. I threw myself into the research, poring over every scrap of information the group had collected. I upgraded my camera equipment, investing in night vision and motion-activated sensors. We trained, studying wilderness survival techniques and learning how to track elusive predators. As the months passed and our expedition drew near, my nights were plagued by increasingly vivid nightmares. In my dreams, I found myself back in those woods, the silence pressing in around me like a physical force. But now, instead of running from the creature, I was hunting it. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the phantom scent of damp earth and rotting leaves lingering in my nostrils. Our team grew as word spread through the tight-knit community of creature hunters and paranormal investigators. By the time we were ready to depart, we numbered 12. Myself, the old man from the diner, whose name I learned was Frank, a cryptozoologist, a retired Marine, a local guide who knew the Ouachita Mountains like the back of his hand, and 7 others, each bringing their own skills and experiences to the group. We gathered one crisp autumn morning at a small airfield on the outskirts of Little Rock. As I looked around at the faces of my companions, I saw a mix of excitement, fear, and grim determination. We loaded our gear into 2 small planes, the weight of our equipment causing the old aircraft to groan in protest. The flight to the remote airstrip near the Ouachita Mountains was tense. I sat next to Alice, the cryptozoologist, who spent the entire journey peppering me with questions about my encounter. "And you're certain about the teeth?" she asked for what felt like the 100th time. "They were definitely crocodilian in nature?" I nodded, my stomach churning as I recalled the creature's massive jaws. "Yes, I'm sure, but bigger, much bigger." She scribbled furiously in her notebook, muttering to herself about convergent evolution and adaptive traits. As we began our descent, I peered out the window at the vast expanse of forest below. From up here it looked peaceful, serene even, but I knew better. Somewhere in that green canopy something was waiting for us. We landed on a small bumpy airstrip that looked like it hadn't been used in years. As we unloaded our gear, the local guide, a weathered man named Tom, gathered us around. "Listen up," he said, his voice gravelly and serious. "These woods ain't like anything you've seen before. They've got a way of turning you around, making you lose your bearings. We stick together, no matter what. Anyone goes missing, we all stop and search. Clear?" We all nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over us like a heavy blanket. The first few days of our expedition were uneventful. We set up a base camp in a clearing about 10 miles from where I had had my encounter. Every day we'd split into teams and scout the surrounding area, looking for any sign of the creature. I was paired with Frank and Alice. As we hiked through the dense underbrush, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. Frank noticed my unease. "It gets easier," he said softly. "The fear never really goes away, but you learn to live with it." I wanted to ask him about his own encounter, but something in his eyes told me it was a topic best left alone. On the 4th day, we found our first real clue. We were following a small stream when Alice suddenly held up her hand, signaling us to stop. She pointed to a mud bank near the water's edge. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of a bear print, with long curved claw marks at the tips of each toe. Alice quickly set to work, taking photos and making a plaster cast of the print. "This is incredible," she muttered, her eyes shining with excitement. "The foot structure, the claw marks, it doesn't match any known species." As she worked, I scanned the surrounding woods, my camera at the ready. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in the trees, gone almost before I could register it. But it was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through my system. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, "I think we're being watched." Frank was at my side in an instant, his rifle raised. "Where?" he asked, his eyes scanning the tree line. I pointed to where I'd seen the movement, but there was nothing there now, just the endless sea of trees and shadows. We radioed the other teams, telling them about the footprint and the possible sighting. The excitement in the camp that night was palpable. For the first time, we had concrete evidence that something was out there. As the days wore on, the signs became more frequent. More footprints, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree bark, and once a half-eaten deer carcass that looked like it had been torn apart by something with immense strength. But still, the creature itself eluded us. It was always one step ahead, leaving signs of its passage, but never allowing itself to be seen. The frustration in the group was growing, as was the tension. It was on the 10th day that everything changed. We were deeper in the woods than we'd ever been, following a series of tracks that seemed fresher than any we'd found before. The silence that had unnerved me so much during my first visit was back, pressing in around us. We came to a small clearing, and my blood ran cold. In the center was a large, flat stone, the same stone I'd seen months ago, stained dark with old blood. "This is it," I whispered to Frank. "This is where I saw it." He nodded grimly, signaling the others to spread out and secure the perimeter. Alice knelt by the stone, taking samples of the stains. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck, and I knew deep in my bones that we'd finally found what we were looking for, or rather, it had found us. The attack came so quickly that we hardly had time to react. One moment, the clearing was empty save for our team. The next, the creature burst from the underbrush, a massive, fur-covered body moving with impossible speed. It was even larger than I remembered, its shoulders easily reaching the height of a tall man. Its face was a nightmarish mix of bear and crocodile, with a long snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that froze me in place, intelligent, almost human-like eyes that burned with an ancient primal hunger. Chaos erupted in the clearing. Gunshots rang out as those with weapons opened fire, but the bullets seemed to do little more than enrage the beast. It lashed out with claws the size of hunting knives, sending one of our team flying through the air. I raised my camera, the action so ingrained that I did it without thinking. The rapid-fire click of the shutter seemed absurdly loud in the mayhem of the attack. The creature's head snapped toward me, those terrible eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I felt a connection, a horrible understanding. This wasn't just an animal. There was an intelligence behind those eyes, a malevolence that went beyond mere predatory instinct. It charged toward me, covering the distance in two massive bounds. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. This was it. This was how I was going to die. But then Frank was there, shoving me aside and raising his rifle. He fired point-blank into the creature's face, the muzzle flash illuminating its features in stark, terrifying detail. The beast reared back, roaring in pain and fury, but instead of pressing the attack, it turned and crashed back into the woods, moving faster than anything that size had any right to move. The clearing fell silent, save for the groans of the injured and the ringing in my ears from the gunfire. I turned to Frank, my mouth open to thank him, but the words died in my throat. He was on the ground, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining the forest floor. "Guess I was a little slow on the dodge," he said, his voice weak but still carrying a hint of his usual dry humor. The next few hours were a blur. We radioed for emergency evacuation, doing our best to tend to the wounded as we waited. When the rescue helicopters arrived, their downdraft whipping the trees into a frenzy, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. We had found the creature, had photographic evidence of its existence, but at what cost? As we lifted off, leaving the dark forest behind, I looked down at my camera. In all the chaos, I had somehow managed to hold on to it. I turned it on with shaking hands, scrolling through the photos I had taken. Most were blurry, useless. But then I came to the last one, taken just as the creature had locked eyes with me. The image was crystal clear, showing the beast in all its terrifying glory. Its teeth, its claws, those intelligent, malevolent eyes, all captured in perfect detail. I had done it. We had done it. We had proof. But as I stared at the photo, a chill ran down my spine. In the background, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, I could see other shapes, more creatures watching the attack. We hadn't just found one monster, we had stumbled upon an entire pack. The aftermath of the expedition was chaotic. 2 members of our team had died in the attack, with several others, including Frank, seriously injured. The survivors were sworn to secrecy by government officials who seemed to appear out of nowhere, confiscating our evidence and debriefing us for hours. But they couldn't take my memory card. In the confusion of the rescue, I had managed to slip it into my boot. Those photos were my proof, my vindication. In the months that followed, I threw myself into research, connecting with others who had similar experiences across the globe. A pattern began to emerge. Sightings of creatures that defied scientific explanation, always in remote forested areas, always accompanied by that unnatural silence. I published my findings anonymously online, including some of the less clear photos from the expedition. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Some dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, but others reached out with their own stories, their own encounters. A community began to form, a network of survivors and researchers all dedicated to uncovering the truth. We shared information, theories, and warnings. We mapped sightings, tracked patterns, and prepared for the day when we would have to face these creatures again. Because I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The way that creature had looked at me, the intelligence behind its eyes, it wasn't just hunting for food, it was playing a game, a deadly game of cat and mouse that had been going on for centuries. And now, as I sit here writing this account, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes late at night I hear scratching at my window. When I look outside, there's never anything there. But I know that somewhere out there in the dark woods of the world, those creatures are waiting and hungry. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. The world is bigger, older, and far more dangerous than we ever imagined. There are things out there, ancient things, that see us as nothing more than prey, and they're watching, always watching. So the next time you're in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, the sense that something's not quite right, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Run, and don't look back. Because if you do, you might just catch a glimpse of what's hunting you. And once you've seen it, truly seen it, you'll never be the same again. As for me, I know my role in this story isn't over. The creature saw me, marked me. One day I'll have to return to those woods, to finish what we started, or to meet my fate at the hands of something science says shouldn't exist. Until then, I'll keep watching the shadows, keep listening for that telltale silence. And I'll remember the lesson I learned in the Ouachita Mountains. In this world there are predators and prey, and sometimes the line between the two is thinner than we'd like to believe. Stay safe, stay vigilant. And whatever you do, don't go into the woods alone. My name is Lyle Kinsler, and for the past decade I've been living off the grid in the dense, unforgiving forests of Oregon. It's a life of solitude, one that I've grown accustomed to after leaving behind the chaos of city life and a failed marriage. Out here, in a cabin I built with my own 2 hands, I found a strange sort of peace. The forest has become my home, its rhythms as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I hunt, I fish, I tend to my small garden, and I watch the seasons change. It's a hard life, but it's honest and it's mine. No cell phones, no internet, no nosy neighbors. Just me, the trees, and the wildlife. Or at least, that's how it used to be. It was late autumn when I first noticed something was amiss. The air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of winter. I was out checking my traps when I came across a group of elk. Now, I've seen plenty of elk in my time out here, but never like this. They were huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling. As I approached, they bolted, scattering in all directions instead of moving as a herd. It was odd, but I chalked it up to a mountain lion in the area. It wasn't until I saw their condition that real concern set in. These elk were emaciated, their ribs visible through their hides, their eyes sunken. This was prime grazing land. There was no reason for them to be starving. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was a week later when I found the first carcass. The memory of it still turns my stomach. I was tracking a deer moving silently through a copse of pines when the stench hit me. It was the unmistakable odor of decay, thick and cloying. Following my nose, I pushed through a tangle of undergrowth and stepped into a small clearing. What I saw there haunts me to this day. The elk lay in the center of the clearing, or what was left of it. Its body had been torn apart, innards strewn across the forest floor like some macabre decoration. But it wasn't the gore that froze me in place. It was the bite marks. Huge, jagged impressions marred what remained of the carcass. Whatever had done this wasn't just killing for food. This was violence for the sake of violence. I've hunted these woods for years and I've never seen anything like it. Not from bears, not from cougars, not from anything. I backed away slowly, my rifle clutched tightly to my chest, my eyes darting between the shadows of the trees. For the first time in years, I felt like prey. In the weeks that followed, things only got worse. More carcasses appeared, each one mutilated in the same horrific manner. It wasn't just elk anymore. I found deer, raccoons, even a bear cub. Nothing seemed safe from whatever was stalking these woods. The forest, once alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, fell silent. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike. I started keeping my rifle closer, even inside the cabin. Sleep became a luxury I could ill afford. Every night I'd sit by the fire, listening to the unnatural quiet, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin settling. When I did manage to doze off, my dreams were filled with visions of torn flesh and those terrible jagged bite marks. It was on one of those sleepless nights that I heard it for the first time, a sound that chilled me to my very core. It started as a low, mournful howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It rose in pitch, becoming a scream that seemed to split the night air. I scrambled for my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The sound came again, closer this time, and with dawning horror I realized it wasn't just one creature. There were several, calling to each other, their cries overlapping in a cacophony of terror. I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. The howls continued, sometimes distant, sometimes so close I was sure they were right outside my door. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, became a constant companion. It was inevitable, I suppose, that they would eventually come for me. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that my cabin would provide some protection, that whatever these things were, they wouldn't dare approach a human dwelling. I was wrong. It happened on a moonless night, the darkness outside my window so complete it seemed to swallow the light from my fire. I was sitting in my chair, rifle across my lap, when I heard it. A heavy thump, like something large moving just outside. My body went rigid, every sense on high alert as I listened to it circle the cabin. The footsteps were deliberate, almost curious. Then they stopped right outside my front door. For a long moment there was silence. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, the slow, deliberate scrape of claws against wood. I stood, my rifle at the ready, as the thing moved to the window. Its massive form blocked out what little light there was, a hulking shadow that seemed to pulse with malevolence. And then I saw its face. God help me, I saw its face. It was a nightmarish fusion of wolf and bear, its snout elongated and filled with razor-sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, or rather the lack of them. Where eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets, black pits that seemed to stare into my very soul. Before I could react, it smashed through the window, glass shattering as it forced its massive body into my cabin. I fired wildly, the sound deafening in the confined space, but the creature barely seemed to notice. It was on me in an instant, its claws raking across my chest as it knocked me to the ground. I was sure I was dead. The creature's fetid breath washed over me, its jaws opening wide. But then, inexplicably, it hesitated. Its head tilted, as if confused, and in that moment of reprieve I acted. I drove my boot into its chest with all my strength, pushing it back just enough to bring my rifle to bear. I fired again, this time aiming for its throat. The shot connected and black ichor sprayed from the wound. The creature howled, a sound of pain and rage that shook the very foundations of my cabin. It clawed at its throat, giving me the opening I needed. I grabbed a knife from the counter and with a yell that was part fear and part fury, I plunged it into the side of its neck. The fight seemed to last an eternity, but in reality it was over in moments. The creature thrashed and convulsed before finally collapsing to the floor, its massive form going still. I stood there panting, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear for what felt like hours. Part of me expected the thing to get back up, to finish what it had started. But it remained motionless, the black ichor pooling beneath it. When I was finally certain it was dead, I dragged its body outside. It was a Herculean task. The creature weighed more than any animal I'd ever encountered. I buried it in a shallow grave, covering it with branches and leaves, hoping it would be enough to keep its brethren away. As dawn broke, casting its pale light over the forest, an eerie calm settled over the woods. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the night's horrors had been nothing but a terrible dream. But the claw marks on my chest and the shattered window of my cabin were stark reminders of the reality I now faced. Whatever these creatures were, they were real, and they were out there. It's been months since that night, and I haven't seen or heard any sign of the creatures. The forest has slowly come back to life, the animals returning, the familiar sounds of nature filling the air once more. But things aren't the same. They never will be. I've repaired my cabin, reinforced the windows and doors. My rifle is always within reach, and I sleep less soundly than I used to. Every shadow holds the potential for danger, every unexplained sound a possible threat. I've considered leaving, going back to civilization and leaving this all behind. But this is my home. I've carved out a life here, and I won't be driven away by fear. So I remain, a solitary sentinel in these woods. I don't know what those creatures were, or if there are more out there. I don't know if they'll come back, but if they do, I'll be ready. The forest holds its secrets, and I've seen the darkness that lurks in its depths. But I've also seen the beauty, the raw, untamed wildness that drew me here in the first place. It's a delicate balance, life out here on the edge of civilization, a balance between solitude and loneliness, between peace and terror. As I sit here watching the sun set behind the trees, I can't help but wonder what the night will bring. But whatever comes, I'll face it. This is my home, my life, and I won't give it up without a fight. They say that the woods around Bear Marsh are haunted, but I've never put much stock in ghost stories. At least I didn't used to. My name's Evan Ralston, and I've lived off the grid in these woods for the last 15 years, ever since I left the chaos of city life behind. After a divorce that sucked the life out of me, and a corporate job that left me feeling like a cog in some soul-crushing machine, I decided I'd had enough. I bought a small plot of land near Bear Marsh in upstate New York, built myself a cabin, and have lived there ever since. It's isolated, peaceful, just the way I like it. I've always been a self-sufficient kind of guy, growing my food, hunting, and fishing. I've never needed much from the outside world. But this place, Bear Marsh, it's not like anywhere else. The locals keep their distance, and every now and then a hiker goes missing, or a hunter turns up dead, mangled by what they claim is a bear. But the old-timers, they whisper that it's something else, something far worse. I've laughed it off as old wives' tales, until that fateful night in late October when everything changed. The day started like any other. I woke up at dawn, brewed some strong coffee, and stepped out onto my porch to watch the mist roll off the marsh. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that gets into your bones. I had planned to spend the day gathering firewood before winter set in, so I grabbed my axe and set off into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further I walked, the thicker the mist became, until it felt like I was the only living thing in the world. I was about 2 miles from the cabin, in a part of the woods I rarely visited, when I first noticed the tracks. They were deep, clawed impressions in the mud, like nothing I'd ever seen, too large to be a bear's and too irregular to be a wolf's. My first thought was that some sort of predator had moved into the area, but there was something wrong with the tracks, something that made my skin crawl. They led deeper into the woods toward the marsh, and like a fool I followed them. I've hunted plenty of animals in my time, But whatever made those tracks was different. I wasn't tracking it. It was leading me somewhere. The trees thinned as I approached the marsh, and the air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and won't let go. The mist thickened until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I was about to turn back when I saw it, something moving in the fog. Just a shadow at first, then more. It was large, larger than any bear I'd ever seen, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky gait. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched behind a fallen log, gripping my axe tight enough to hurt. The creature came into view, and I felt a chill unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was covered in matted fur, a patchwork of black and gray that seemed to shift and ripple like water. Its limbs were long, too long, with joints that bent the wrong way. Its face was the worst part, though, half hidden in the mist, but enough to see it wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered. It had a maw filled with crooked teeth, each one like a jagged shard of bone, and its eyes. I didn't dare look into them for more than a moment, but what I saw was enough. There was no intelligence there, only hunger. I've never been one to scare easily, but this thing, whatever it was, sent a surge of primal fear through me. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the way it moved, the way the world seemed to shrink around it, like the trees were pulling back in fear. I knew I had to get out of there, but as I slowly backed away, the creature's head snapped up and it turned toward me, sniffing the air. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I bolted through the woods like a deer with its tail on fire, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, faster than anything that size should be. My heart hammered in my chest, and my lungs burned as I pushed myself to keep going. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I didn't slow down. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, hear the snapping of its jaws as it tried to catch me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, and I found myself back near my cabin. My legs gave out and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. For a long time I just sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It didn't make any sense. Nothing that big, that monstrous, should be able to move like that. When I finally caught my breath, I forced myself to stand and staggered back to my cabin. I locked the door behind me, something I'd never done in all my years out here. I grabbed my old shotgun from its place above the mantel and loaded it, my hands trembling. Then I sat in the corner, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. The night was long. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside set my nerves on edge. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything except those eyes and those teeth. It wasn't until dawn that I finally allowed myself to relax, just a little. The sunlight brought with it a sense of safety, as if whatever lurked out there in the dark couldn't stand the light. But even in the daylight, I knew I couldn't stay. That thing, whatever it was, would come back. It had my scent now, and I didn't doubt for a second that it would find me again. I needed to get out of these woods, get back to town, and warn someone. But there was a part of me that knew no one would believe me. They'd think I'd gone mad, that I'd been out here too long, alone with my thoughts. I packed a bag, took only what I could carry, and set out toward the nearest road. The walk was long and nerve-wracking. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept my shotgun at the ready, though I wasn't sure it would do much good against that thing. I hadn't gotten more than a mile when I heard it again, the sound of something large moving through the trees. It was close, too close. I could hear it breathing, a deep, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. I backed up slowly, trying to put some distance between us, but it was no use. The creature burst through the trees, barreling toward me with a speed that defied its size. I had no choice. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed through the woods and the creature staggered, but it didn't go down. Blood splattered the trees behind it, but all that seemed to do was make it angrier. It let out a sound, a noise that I can only describe as a cross between a roar and a shriek, and charged again. I fired again, aiming for its head this time. The shot connected and the creature collapsed, sliding to a stop a few feet in front of me. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my chest heaving and my legs shaking. Only then did I look back. The woods were silent, the creature nowhere to be seen. I knew it was dead. I'd seen it fall, but the sight of its lifeless body wasn't something I could forget. I made it back to town, found a phone, and called the sheriff. I told him everything, and to my surprise, he believed me. He told me stories I'd dismissed as nonsense, about other hunters and hikers who'd seen the same thing, who hadn't been as lucky as I was. He sent a couple of deputies out to the marsh to check it out, and when they returned, they had the creature's body with them. They took it to some lab in Albany, said it was for further study, whatever that means. All I know is that it's dead and I'm alive. I'm not going back to Bear Marsh, not ever. I've had enough of living off the grid. I'll find somewhere else, somewhere quieter, safer. But I'll never forget that thing, whatever it was. I don't think anyone who saw it could. It's been a year since that night in Bear Marsh. I've settled into a small town on the coast as far from those woods as I could get, but the nightmares haven't stopped. I still wake up in cold sweats, the memory of those eyes, that unnatural gait, fresh in my mind. I've tried to move on, to forget, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes when the wind howls at night, I swear I can hear that unearthly shriek. And when the fog rolls in from the sea, thick and impenetrable, I find myself reaching for a gun that's no longer there. They say the creature of Bear Marsh is dead, that science has explained it away as some mutant bear or wolf, but I know the truth. I saw it with my own eyes, and deep down, I fear that what I encountered that night wasn't alone, that somewhere out there in the dark places of the world, more of them are waiting for the unwary to stumble into their domain, waiting to remind us that we're not at the top of the food chain, that we're just prey in a world far more terrifying than we ever imagined. So if you're ever near Bear Marsh, or any place where the trees grow too thick and the shadows seem to move on their own, remember my story, and run. Run as fast as you can, because you never know what's lurking just beyond the edge of your vision, waiting for its chance to strike. It all started with a simple desire for peace and quiet. My name is your name, and I never imagined that my quest for solitude would lead me down a path of unimaginable horror. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. The year was 2018, and I had just returned from my third tour in Afghanistan. The transition back to civilian life was challenging, to say the least. The constant noise of the city, the endless sea of faces, the relentless pace of modern life, it all felt overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that I no longer fit into the world I had once called home. It was during one of my mandatory therapy sessions that the idea first took root. Dr. Simmons, a kind-faced woman with graying hair and understanding eyes, had suggested that I might benefit from some time away from the hustle and bustle of urban life. "Have you ever considered taking a break?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Perhaps spend some time in nature, away from all the stimuli that seem to be troubling you?" I laughed it off at first. "What, like a camping trip? I've had enough of roughing it in the desert, Doc." But the idea persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What if I didn't just take a break? What if I left it all behind? The more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. No more crowded streets, no more blaring car horns, no more expectations to conform to a society that felt increasingly alien. Just me, the wilderness, and the kind of peace I hadn't known since before I enlisted. It took me 6 months to put everything in order. I sold my apartment, liquidated most of my assets, and started researching locations. I wanted somewhere remote, somewhere I could truly disconnect from the world. That's when I stumbled upon a listing for a small cabin in the dense forests of northern Maine. The property was perfect, 50 acres of pristine woodland, a sturdy log cabin with solar panels and a well, and most importantly, no neighbors for miles around. The real estate agent tried to dissuade me, warning about the harsh winters and the isolation, but her words only cemented my decision. 2 weeks later, I was the proud owner of my own little slice of wilderness. The day I arrived at my new home, a sense of calm washed over me that I hadn't felt in years. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a bird. For the first time since returning from overseas, I felt like I could breathe. I spent that first day exploring my property, getting a feel for the land that was now mine. The cabin itself was small but solid, with a single main room that served as both living area and bedroom, a tiny kitchen and a bathroom with a composting toilet. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was mine, and it was away from everything that had been slowly suffocating me. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I sat on the small porch with a cup of coffee, watching the shadows lengthen across my new domain. I felt a sense of peace, of rightness. This, I thought, was where I belonged. If only I had known then what horrors awaited me in those woods. If only I had realized that sometimes the monsters we carry inside us are nothing compared to the ones that lurk in the shadows of the forest. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about those first few months, about learning to live off the grid, about the challenges and the triumphs, and about old Pete, the man who had become my only link to the outside world, and ultimately the catalyst for the nightmare that was to come. The first few weeks were challenging, to say the least. I had done my research, of course, but there's a world of difference between reading about living off the grid and actually doing it. Every day brought new lessons, some learned the hard way. Take the solar panels, for instance. I had been so proud of myself for choosing a cabin with a renewable energy source. What I hadn't accounted for were the long, overcast days that are common in Maine. There were times when I had to ration my electricity use, learning to live by the rhythms of the sun rather than the convenience of the power grid. Then there was the matter of food. I had brought enough supplies to last me a month, figuring that would be plenty of time to get the hang of hunting and foraging. Ha! My first attempts at hunting were nothing short of comical. I'd wake up before dawn, grab the hunting rifle I had purchased, legally of course, and head out into the woods. I'd sit for hours, perfectly still, waiting for any sign of game. More often than not, I'd return to the cabin empty-handed, my stomach growling and my pride wounded. It took me nearly 2 weeks to bag my first deer, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I shed a tear of relief when I finally succeeded. That night, as I sat by the fire pit outside the cabin, savoring the taste of venison I had hunted myself, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't experienced since my days in the military. Foraging was another adventure entirely. I had bought a few guidebooks on edible plants native to the area, but identifying them in the wild was another matter. There were a few close calls. Let's just say that not all berries are meant for human consumption, and leave it at that. But gradually I learned to distinguish the safe from the poisonous, the nutritious from the merely decorative. Winter brought its own set of challenges. The first snowfall was beautiful, transforming the forest into a winter wonderland. But the novelty wore off quickly when I realized just how much work it took to keep the paths clear, to prevent the weight of the snow from damaging the solar panels, to keep myself warm when the temperature dropped well below freezing. There were nights when the wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice, when I questioned my decision to come out here. Nights when the darkness pressed in on all sides, and the silence was so complete it seemed to have a weight of its own. On those nights I would sit by the wood stove, a cup of whiskey in hand, and remind myself why I had chosen this life. But for every hardship there was a moment of pure, transcendent beauty. Watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered trees in shades of gold and pink. Spotting a family of deer picking their way delicately through the forest. The taste of fresh trout, caught from the stream that ran through my property and cooked over an open fire. The profound sense of accomplishment that came with each new skill mastered, each challenge overcome. Slowly but surely, I was adapting to this new life. My body grew stronger, more attuned to the physical demands of off-grid living. My mind, once constantly on edge, began to find peace in the rhythms of nature. The nightmares that had plagued me since my return from Afghanistan became less frequent, replaced by dreamless sleep born of honest physical exhaustion. It was during this time that I first met old Pete. I had been living in the cabin for about 4 months, when I heard the sound of an engine struggling up the rough track that led to my home. Curious and a little wary, I wasn't expecting visitors after all. I stepped out onto the porch, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I kept by the door. What I saw was an ancient pickup truck, more rust than paint, crawling up the path. It came to a stop a few yards from the cabin, and out stepped the oldest, most weathered-looking man I had ever seen. He was tall and lean, with a beard that reached halfway down his chest, and eyes that seemed to have seen everything the world had to offer. "Well, well," he called out, his voice gravelly but warm. "Looks like we got ourselves a new neighbor." And just like that, old Pete became a part of my life. He lived about 5 miles away, in a cabin even more rustic than mine. He had been living off the grid for over 30 years, and he took it upon himself to show me the ropes. Over the next few months, Pete became my mentor, my connection to the outside world, and, in a way I hadn't expected, my friend. He taught me how to track game more effectively, showed me the best fishing spots, and shared knowledge about the forest that no guidebook could match. In return, I shared news from the world beyond our little wilderness, stories he seemed to savor like a fine wine. We fell into a routine. Every week or so, Pete would drive up in his battered old truck, and we'd spend the day trading goods, stories, skills. Sometimes we'd work together on projects around my cabin or his. Other times we'd just sit on the porch, sharing a bottle of moonshine he swore he made himself, though I had my doubts, watching the sun set over the trees. It was during one of these evenings, as the sky turned from blue to pink to deep purple, that Pete first mentioned the stories. Old legends, he called them, tales passed down by the indigenous people who had once called these forests home. Stories of creatures that lurked in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, creatures that were neither man nor beast, that hungered for more than just flesh and blood. I laughed them off at the time, attributing them to too much moonshine and an old man's love of tall tales. But there was something in Pete's eyes as he spoke, a seriousness that seemed at odds with his usual easygoing demeanor. "You laugh now, boy," he said, his voice low and grave. "But these woods, they're old. Older than you or me, older than any of the fancy buildings in the cities you left behind. And old places, they have a way of keeping secrets, of harboring things that ought not exist." I shrugged off his warnings, chalking them up to superstition and isolation. After all, I was a modern man, a veteran. I had seen real horrors in the deserts of Afghanistan. What could these peaceful woods possibly hold that could compare to that? Oh, how wrong I was. How terribly, tragically wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about the day everything changed. The day old Pete didn't show up for our usual trade. The day I ventured into a part of the forest I had never seen before. The day I came face to face with a nightmare made flesh. It was a Tuesday when the world as I knew it began to unravel. I remember because Tuesdays were usually when old Pete would come by for our weekly trade in ketchup. I had grown accustomed to the sound of his ancient truck struggling up the path, the rasp of his voice calling out a greeting. But on this particular Tuesday there was nothing. Just the usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird call, the distant gurgle of the stream. At first I didn't think much of it. Pete wasn't exactly a stickler for schedules, and it wasn't uncommon for him to be a day late if he got caught up in some project or other. Wednesday came and went, still no Pete. A tendril of worry began to curl in my gut, but I pushed it aside. He was a grown man after all, and had been living out here far longer than I had. Probably just lost track of time, I told myself. By Thursday, that tendril of worry had blossomed into full-blown concern. In all the months I'd known him, Pete had never gone this long without checking in. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I spent most of that day debating with myself. Should I go check on him? Was I overreacting? What if he had just decided he needed some alone time? But every time I tried to rationalize it away, that nagging feeling in my gut would resurface. Finally, as the sun began to set, I made my decision. First thing in the morning, I would hike out to Pete's cabin, just to check, just to be sure. I barely slept that night. My dreams were plagued by vague, unsettling images, shadows moving where they shouldn't, eyes gleaming in the darkness, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the chill in the air. As the first light of day began to filter through the trees, I set out. I packed a day's worth of supplies, water, some jerky, a first aid kit. and after a moment's hesitation I strapped on my hunting knife and slung my rifle over my shoulder. Better safe than sorry, I told myself, trying to ignore the voice in the back of my mind that whispered that I might need them. The hike to Pete's cabin usually took about 2 hours at a leisurely pace. I set out at a brisk walk, my senses alert for any sign of danger. It was during this hike that I first noticed something was off about the forest. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but about an hour into my journey, it hit me. The forest was too quiet. Now, a forest is never truly silent. There's always some ambient noise, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the hum of insects. But as I made my way deeper into the woods, those sounds began to fade away. By the time I was approaching the area where Pete's cabin stood, the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the leaves. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself gripping my rifle a little tighter. Every instinct honed by years in the military was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. And then I saw it. Pete's cabin. Even from a distance I could tell something was amiss. The door was hanging off its hinges, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. As I got closer, I could see that the windows were shattered, shards of glass glittering on the ground like fallen stars. "Pete?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Pete, are you there?" No response. With my heart pounding in my chest, I approached the cabin. The porch creaked ominously under my weight, and I had to step carefully to avoid the broken glass. As I reached the doorway, the smell hit me, a nauseating mixture of copper and decay that I recognized all too well from my time in the war. Blood, and lots of it. I pushed the door open, wincing at the screech of protesting hinges. The interior of the cabin was a scene of utter devastation. Furniture was overturned, cupboards flung open, their contents strewn across the floor. But what caught my eye were the marks, deep gouges in the wooden walls and floor, as if something with massive claws had torn through the place, and the blood. Oh God, the blood. It was everywhere. A dark pool near the door, smears on the walls, bloody footprints leading out into the forest. But among all this carnage, one thing was conspicuously absent: Pete himself. I searched the cabin thoroughly, my military training kicking in despite the horror of the situation. No sign of a body, no sign of Pete, just destruction and blood. I don't know how long I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. It was like my brain couldn't quite accept the reality in front of me. This kind of violence, this level of destruction, it didn't belong here in these peaceful woods. This was the kind of scene I had left behind in war-torn countries, not something I ever expected to find in the forests of Maine. As I stood there, my eyes fell on something partially hidden under an overturned chair. Pete's old rifle, the one he had shown me how to clean and maintain, the one he had used to teach me the finer points of hunting in these woods. With shaking hands, I picked it up. It was undamaged, somehow having escaped whatever force had torn through the rest of the cabin. I checked the chamber. It was fully loaded. Whatever had happened here, Pete hadn't even had a chance to fire a shot. That's when I noticed the footprints, or rather the tracks. They started at the pool of blood near the door and led out into the forest, but these weren't human footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of massive claws at the end of each toe. In that moment, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I could have turned back, could have hiked to the nearest town and reported what I'd found, could have let the authorities handle it. That would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But Pete was my friend, my only friend out here, and if there was even the slightest chance he was still alive, I had to try to find him. With Pete's rifle in hand and my own strapped to my back, I set out to follow the tracks. They led deeper into the forest, to an area I had never explored before. The trees here seemed older, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snatch at my clothes as I passed. The silence that had been so oppressive at Pete's cabin seemed to deepen with every step I took. It was as if the very air was thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. I found myself moving as quietly as I could, every snapped twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot in the unnatural quiet. As I ventured further, I began to notice other unsettling details. Claw marks on trees, some so high up I couldn't imagine what kind of creature could have made them. Patches of fur caught on low-hanging branches, fur that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. And the smell, that same coppery scent of blood, mixed with something else, something musky and alien. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this strange, twisted part of the forest. The canopy above was so thick that little sunlight penetrated, leaving everything in a perpetual twilight. More than once I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. And then I found the clearing. It was a roughly circular area, maybe 20 feet across, where no trees grew. In the center was a mound of freshly turned earth, surrounded by... I still have trouble describing what I saw. Bodies, animal carcasses in various states of decay. Deer, rabbits, what looked like a bear. And mixed in with them, unmistakably human remains. Scraps of clothing, bones picked clean. The smell was overwhelming. I had to fight the urge to vomit as I approached the mound. Flies buzzed around it in a thick cloud, and as I got closer I saw movement. Something was on top of the mound, hunched over, tearing it. I realized with horror that it was gnawing on a human hand. Pete's hand. I recognized the old burn scar on the thumb, a story he had told me over drinks one night. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, I'm not sure. But whatever it was enough to alert the creature. It raised its head, and for the first time I saw what had been terrorizing these woods. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even hunched over as it was. Its body was covered in a patchwork of fur and what looked like cracked, leathery skin. But its face... God, its face. It was like someone had taken a wolf's head and stretched it over a human skull, leaving it misshapen and wrong. Its eyes were a deep, bloody red, and its mouth was filled with row upon row of shark-like teeth, far too many to fit in a normal jaw. For a moment we just stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. The creature tilted its head almost curiously, and then it moved. It was fast, impossibly fast for something of its size. One moment it was on top of the mound, the next it was charging straight at me. I raised Pete's rifle and fired, the sound deafening in the unnatural silence of the forest. The shot hit it in the shoulder, but it barely seemed to notice. I fired again and again, my hand shaking so badly I'm amazed I hit it at all. One shot grazed its head, and it let out a howl that shook the trees around us. It wasn't a sound any earthly creature should be able to make. It was rage and pain and hunger all rolled into one terrible noise. The creature backed off, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. I kept the rifle trained on it, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I knew I probably couldn't kill it. But I had to try, for Pete, for myself, for anyone else who might wander into these god-forsaken woods. That's when I saw it. An old rotting tree branch hanging precariously above us. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan I had. I began to back up slowly, keeping my eyes on the creature. It followed, matching me step for step. When I was in position, I took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to a god I wasn't sure I believed in anymore, and made my move. The creature lunged at the same moment I ducked and rolled to the side. I came up on one knee and fired at the branch above. The shot hit its mark. There was a tremendous crack, and the branch came crashing down. For a moment I thought I had missed, that the creature had dodged it. But then I heard a howl of pain and rage. The branch had caught the creature, pinning it to the ground. I didn't waste time. I ran forward, pressing the barrel of the rifle against the side of its misshapen head. Its red eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw something there. Not just animal hunger or rage, but a cold, alien intelligence. It knew what was about to happen, and it hated me for it. I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed through the forest, and then everything went quiet. The creature lay still, dark blood pooling around its shattered skull. I stood there, breathing heavily, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. It was over. Whatever this thing was, wherever it had come from, it was dead. But so was Pete. So were who knows how many others who had fallen victim to this monster. I knew I should do something, bury the remains, alert the authorities, something. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting as far away from this place as possible. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making or the branches that whipped at my face. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest around me looked unfamiliar, the trees too close together, the shadows too deep. For a terrifying moment, I thought I might be lost, trapped in this nightmare forest forever. But then I heard it, the faint sound of running water. The stream. If I could find the stream, I could follow it back to my cabin. With renewed energy, I pushed on, following the sound. It was nearly dark by the time I stumbled out of the forest and saw my cabin. I've never been so relieved to see anything in my life. I practically fell through the door, slamming it shut behind me and collapsing onto the floor. I don't know how long I lay there, shaking and crying. When I finally pulled myself together, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen, not knowing what might still be out there in those woods. The next morning I packed up what I could carry and started the long hike back to civilization. I reported what had happened to the local authorities, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe me. Can't say I blame them. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it either. They did send out a search party, though. They found Pete's cabin just as I had described it. They found the clearing too, with its mound of bodies. But the creature's corpse was gone. Maybe its pack had come and dragged it away. Maybe it wasn't as dead as I thought. I try not to think about that too much. I'm back in the city now. Got a small apartment, a job that doesn't ask too many questions about where I've been or what I've done. But I can't shake the memories of what I saw in those woods. Every time I close my eyes, I see that creature's face, those rows of teeth, those intelligent, hate-filled eyes. Sometimes late at night, when the city sounds die down and everything gets quiet, I think I can hear something. A howl in the distance. The sound of large clawed feet padding down the street outside my window. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the trauma playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. Those creatures, whatever they are, they're still out there, waiting, hunting, and sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder if maybe I didn't escape at all. Maybe this is all just a dream, and I'm still in those woods, trapped in an endless nightmare. Because the alternative, that what I saw was real, that such monsters actually exist in our world, that's almost too terrible to contemplate. So I sit here, night after night, staring out my window at the city lights, and I wonder about what's really out there in the dark. I wonder about old Pete and all the others who disappeared in those woods. And I wonder how long it will be before they find me again. Because deep down, I know the truth. You can leave the forest, but the forest never really leaves you. And neither do its monsters.